There is a particular kind of silence that fills a room when a child is crying without sound. It is quiet the way other silences are quiet. It has weight. It presses against the walls and against the chest of anyone standing nearby, demanding something they cannot name. A Thursday evening in late October, that silence filled a small apartment on the second floor of a building on Sycamore Street, and a man named Leo Vance stood in the middle of it, holding his 6-year-old daughter, unable to fix the one thing she needed most. The apartment was small and neat in the way that spaces maintained by exhausted single parents often are. Not everything in its place, because there was no energy left for disorder. A single sofa in a muted grey, Child's crayon drawing taped to the refrigerator, the edges curling. A pair of small shoes by the door, placed exactly side by side. Leo's hands, still carrying the faint smell of industrial solvent from a shift that had ended 2 hours earlier, rested gently on his daughter's back as her small shoulders shook with a grief she could not explain to him. Her name was Maya. She had been born with profound sensorineural hearing loss, diagnosed at 14 months, and she communicated through American Sign Language, a language Leo had learned not in a classroom but in the hard, practical way of a father who could not bear the thought of his child feeling alone inside her own home. Had taught himself through YouTube videos at first, late at night after she fell asleep, rewinding the same clip 10 times until his hands remembered the shape of a word. He had practiced in the mirror during his lunch breaks. He had driven 40 minutes to a weekend workshop taught by a deaf instructor named Helena Cruz, the only one within 100 miles, and he had shown up every single Saturday for 8 months until his vocabulary caught up to the speed of his daughter's growing mind. But tonight, something had broken that chain of understanding. Maya had come home from school with a face Leo had learned to recognize. The particular tightness around her eyes, the way her hands stayed still at her sides, instead of moving in the excited, restless way they usually did. They had sat down at the kitchen table and signed something to him, something urgent. And Leo had watched her hands move and had not understood. Not, she repeated it, slower, her small fingers forming each sign with exaggerated care, the way a child does when they are trying very hard to be patient with an adult who is failing them. Leo watched the shapes again, his mind scrambling to match the signs to meaning, and came up empty. I felt the familiar cold wash of inadequacy move through his chest. I had been here before in the early days when his vocabulary was still thin, and every conversation felt like a test he was barely passing. But he had thought those days were behind him. He had been working so hard. "I'm sorry, baby," he signed back, his hands slower than he wanted them to be. "Don't know that one." Aya's face crumpled. She shook her head, a small defeated motion, and turned away from him. Walked to her room and closed the door, not hard, not slammed, just closed, and the silence that followed was the kind Leo would remember for a long time afterward. I stood in the kitchen, his hands still raised, halfway to a sign he had not been able to complete, and he felt the full weight of that failure settle onto his shoulders. He had learned this language for her. He had given it everything he had, and still there were gaps. Still, there were moments when she needed him to understand, and he could not. I did not know, standing there in the quiet of his small apartment, that someone else had been watching. A woman named Evelyn Croft, 41 years old, the founder and CEO of Meridian Capital Partners, one of the most quietly powerful investment firms in the state. She was sitting in her car in the parking lot of the building across the street, having just dropped off a document for a client who lived in that complex. And she had seen a man in a work uniform carry a small girl into the building, the girl's face buried in his neck. She had seen the way his hand cradled the back of her head, the way he did not rush, the way he held her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. Evelyn had a daughter of her own. Name was Grace, and she was 9 years old, and she had been born with a cochlear implant after a sudden hearing loss at age 3 that no doctor could fully explain. Grace communicated through a mix of speech and ASL, and Evelyn had learned the language in the same hard way Leo had. Late nights, endless practice, the constant fear that she was not doing enough. But Evelyn was also the kind of woman who had built a company from nothing, who had made her name by being the smartest person in every room. She had learned long ago that admitting weakness was not something she did well. They sat in her car a moment longer, watching the light come on in a second-floor window, and she made a decision she would not fully understand until much later. Got out of the car, crossed the street, and walked up to the building's entrance. She did not know his name. She did not know his story. But she had seen the way he held his daughter, and she had seen the way the girl's hands had moved. And she knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with business, that she had just witnessed something important. The buzzer in Leo's apartment was old and had a habit of crackling when it was pressed, a sound that always startled him because it meant someone was at the ground floor door, and he almost never had visitors. Crossed to the intercom, pressed the talk button, and heard a woman's voice, clear and composed, say, "I'm sorry to bother you. I saw you coming in with your daughter." Leo hesitated. Was not the kind of man who opened his door to strangers, especially not at this hour, with his daughter upset in the next room and his own patience frayed thin. But something in the woman's voice stopped him from saying no. It was not the warmth of it. Not was the precision, the careful choice of words, the pause before she said help, as if she had measured the weight of that word and decided it was worth using. I buzzed her in. Evelyn Croft climbed the stairs to the second floor and found him standing in the doorway of apartment 2B, still in his work coveralls, his face carrying the particular guarded wariness of a man who had learned not to trust kindness without a reason. She introduced herself quickly, gave him her card, and explained what she had seen from the parking lot. She did not mention her own daughter yet, did not explain why she had crossed the street. She simply said, "I saw your daughter signing to you, and I saw that you didn't understand. I've been there." Leo looked at the card. Meridian Capital Partners. He did not know the name, but he recognized the weight of the paper, the clean design, the kind of card that cost more than a simple business card should. He looked back at her. "I don't understand," he said. Evelyn took a breath. "I have a daughter. She's 9. I lost her hearing at 3 and she uses ASL. Learned the language for her, the same way you did. Late nights and YouTube, and a lot of getting it wrong. And I still miss things. I still have moments where she needs me to understand, and I can't. Saw that look on your face just now from across the street, and I recognized it." Leo's hand tightened on the doorframe. He did not know what to say. He was not used to being seen. He was not used to someone naming the thing he was feeling before he had found the words for it himself. "There's a program," Evelyn continued. "Immersive ASL course taught by a deaf instructor named Helena Cruz. Not bite advanced. It's the kind of course that fills the gaps that standard classes leave behind. Took it 2 years ago, and it changed everything for me. I can give you the information." Leo was quiet for a long moment. I thought of Maya's face when she had turned away from him. He thought of the closed door, and he thought of his hands, still raised halfway to a sign he had not been able to complete. He asked again, Evelyn met his eyes. "Because someone did it for me," she said. "And because I saw the way you held your daughter." She handed him a folded piece of paper with a phone number and a website written on it. She did not wait for him to thank her. He simply nodded once, turned and walked back down the stairs, leaving Leo standing in his doorway with the weight of a stranger's kindness in his hands and the quiet sound of his daughter's breathing through the wall behind him. The 3 weeks that followed were not easy. Leo worked the early shift at the industrial supply warehouse, where he had been employed for 7 years, a job that demanded physical endurance and left his hands raw and his back aching by the time he clocked out. Picked Maya up from the after-school program at 4, made dinner, helped with homework, and then, after she was asleep, sat at the kitchen table with a laptop that was older than she was, and began the work of learning a language he had thought he already knew. Eleanor Cruz's advanced immersion course was not like the YouTube videos he had relied on before. It was demanding. It required him to record himself signing and submit the videos for critique. It required him to learn not just vocabulary but nuance, the difference between a sign that meant frustrated and a sign that meant exhausted, a subtle shift in hand position that changed worried into terrified. He failed the first week's assignment. He signed a phrase that was supposed to mean "I am listening to you," and instead signed something closer to "I am ignoring you on purpose." Helena's feedback was direct and unsparing. Did not praise him for trying. She told him exactly where he had gone wrong and expected him to try again. "Fine," he did. I practiced in the mirror during his lunch breaks, his co-workers glancing at him with the particular curiosity of men who did not ask questions but noticed everything. He practiced while stirring pasta on the stove, one hand moving through the shapes of words, while the other held the wooden spoon. I practiced while Maya slept, his hands forming the same signs over and over until they felt natural, until they stopped being translations and started being the way he thought. And slowly something began to shift. I started to catch words he had missed before. I started to see the patterns beneath the signs, the grammar of a language that had its own logic, its own poetry. I started to understand not just what Maya was saying, but how she was saying it. The speed of her hands when she was excited, the small pause before a word that mattered to her, the way she sometimes held the last sign a beat longer when she was not sure she had been understood. But there was still one word he could not find. The word she had tried to tell him that Thursday night. The word that had sent her to her room with her small shoulders shaking. I had asked Helena about it, describing the shape of the sign as best he could remember. And Helena had looked at him with an expression he could not read. "That's a difficult one," she had signed back. "It doesn't have a direct English equivalent." An old sign. Leo had felt the word settle into his chest like a stone. He had been trying to learn her language for 6 years. We had thought he was doing enough. And his daughter had been carrying a word for grief that she could not share with him because he had not been ready to receive it. The Saturday morning of the 8th week of the course, Leo woke before dawn to the sound of rain against the window and the quiet, familiar weight of Maya climbing onto the edge of his bed. She did not sign anything at first. She simply sat there, her small legs crossed, her hands resting in her lap, watching him with the particular patience of a child who had learned to wait for adults to catch up. Leo sat up slowly, rubbed his eyes and signed, "Good morning." Maya nodded. Then her hands began to move, and Leo felt his chest tighten because he recognized the shape of the sign she was making. It was the same one she had tried to show him 8 weeks earlier, the same one he had failed to understand. The one that meant the grief of being unable to share what matters most with the person you love most. But this time she did not stop there. She kept signing, her small hands forming a sequence that Leo followed carefully, word by word, his mind working to keep pace with her meaning. She told him that she had been trying to tell him something important that night, something that had been building in her for weeks, something she had not known how to say, because she was afraid it would hurt him. Signed, I know you work so hard for us. I know you are tired. I know you learned this whole language for me. I love you for it. Leo's hands went still in his lap. The rain continued against the window. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of water and the distant hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. Looked at his daughter, really looked at her. Not at the signs she was making, not at the shapes of her hands, but at her face, at the particular set of her jaw, at the way her eyes held his without flinching. She was not angry. She was not accusing. She was telling him something true, the way children sometimes do when they have finally found the words and the courage to say them. I signed back slowly, carefully, making sure each sign was exact. You are right. I have been so focused on learning the language that I forgot the language is not the point. You are the point. Maya's face softened. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, a gesture she had done since she was a toddler. Wordless signal that meant I am here, and you are here, and that is enough. They sat like that for a long moment, the rain falling outside, the light slowly filling the room, and Leo felt something shift inside him. Not a breakthrough, not a solution, just a quiet recalibration, the kind that happens when you finally stop trying so hard and simply listen. He did not know yet that the hardest part was still ahead. He did not know that Evelyn Croft's decision to cross the street that night would lead to something neither of them had expected. But for now, in the grey light of a rainy Saturday morning, with his daughter's forehead pressed against his, he understood what she had been trying to tell him all along. And that was enough. 2 weeks later, Leo received a phone call that he almost did not answer. The number was unfamiliar, and he was in the middle of helping Maya with a school project that involved construction paper and glue and the particular kind of chaos that only a 6-year-old could create. But something made him pick up, and the voice on the other end belonged to Evelyn Croft. Did not waste time with pleasantries. She told him that Meridian Capital Partners was hosting a charity gala in 3 weeks, an annual event that raised money for deaf education programs across the state. She told him that the keynote speaker had cancelled unexpectedly, and that she had been thinking about his story, about the way he had learned ASL for his daughter, about the night she had seen him in the doorway of his apartment, and she wanted to know if he would be willing to speak. Leo laughed. Not a mean laugh, but the kind of laugh that comes from a place of genuine disbelief. He told her he was a warehouse worker who had learned sign language from YouTube videos. He told her he was not a speaker. He told her he did not own a suit. Evelyn listened without interrupting, and when he was finished, she said, I am not asking you to give a speech. I'm asking you to tell your story. The way you held your daughter. The reason you learned the language. The night you could not understand her, and the morning she finally told you what she needed. That is not a speech. Leo was quiet for a long time. He looked at Maya, who had stopped arranging pieces of orange construction paper and was watching him with the particular curiosity of a child who could sense that something important was happening. I'll think about it, he said. Not he did more than think. Over the following days, he found himself turning the idea over in his mind, the way he turned over a difficult sign in his practice sessions, testing its shape, feeling its weight. I talked to Helena about it after class, and she signed back, "You have something to say." I talked to Maya about it, carefully, signing slowly to make sure she understood. Looked at him with her serious, searching eyes and signed back, "You are teaching me to use my voice." The night of the gala, Leo stood in front of a mirror in a borrowed suit that fit well enough, adjusted his collar, and felt the particular weight of a room full of strangers waiting to be moved. He did not have a speech written. He had a story, and he had learned through months of hard, humbling work that a story told with honesty could reach places that polished words never could. They walked to the stage, looked out at the sea of faces, and began to sign. He did not speak at first. He stood at the podium, his hands at his sides, and let the silence settle over the room. 1,000 eyes watched him, the man in the borrowed suit with grease still faintly visible under his fingernails, the man who had never spoken to a crowd before. He raised his hands and began to sign, and a woman seated near the front, a professional interpreter, spoke his words aloud for the hearing audience. "I learned American Sign Language for my daughter," he signed, his movements slow and deliberate, the way Helena had taught him. "I learned it because she was born into a world that was not built for her, and I refused to let her face that world alone. I thought that learning the language was enough." Paused. The room was completely still. I told them about the night on the couch, the word he could not understand, the small shoulders shaking in the next room. I told them about the 3 weeks of failure, the late nights, the critique sessions that left him feeling like he had learned nothing at all. I told them about the rainy Saturday morning when his daughter had finally told him the truth, not with accusation, but with love. She told me that I was so busy trying to understand the words that I forgot to understand her. He signed. And she was right. A woman in the 3rd row pressed a hand to her mouth. A man near the back wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist. Leo kept signing. "I am not here to tell you that I have figured it out," he continued. "I am here to tell you that I am still learning, every day. That the most important lesson I have learned is not a sign or a grammatical rule. It is this: the point of language is not to be fluent. The point of language is to be present." He lowered his hands and looked out at the audience. The interpreter finished the last sentence, and the room held its breath for a single, suspended moment before the applause began. It was not the polite, measured applause of a charity gala. It was the kind that came from a place deeper than politeness, the kind that rose from chests and filled the room with a sound that felt almost physical. Leo stood at the podium, his hands trembling slightly, and he did not know where to look. I found Evelyn Croft in the front row, her eyes bright, her hands raised in a slow, deliberate sign that he recognized immediately. It was the sign for thank you, but she held it a beat longer than necessary, the way Maya sometimes did when she wanted to be sure she had been understood. He signed it back to her, and then he stepped away from the podium and walked off the stage, the applause still rising behind him like a wave that showed no signs of breaking. In the weeks that followed, Leo's life did not transform overnight, in the way that stories sometimes promised. He still woke at 5 in the morning, still drove to the warehouse, still came home with sore hands and a tired back. Aya still had difficult days, still struggled with the particular loneliness of being a deaf child in a hearing world, still needed him to listen more than he spoke. But something had shifted in the space between them, a new kind of trust that did not depend on perfect fluency. Evelyn Croft called him a week after the gala and offered him a position at Meridian Capital Partners. not as a speaker or a figurehead, but as a liaison to the firm's growing philanthropic initiatives in deaf education. She told him that she had been looking for someone who understood the work from the inside, someone who had lived the struggle and chosen to stay in it, and that she had not found anyone better suited than the man she had seen in a grocery store parking lot on a Thursday night. Leo turned her down, gently, carefully, the way he had learned to deliver difficult news to Maya when she asked questions he could not answer. I told her that he was not ready to leave the warehouse, that his life had a rhythm he was not willing to disrupt, that the work he did with his hands was honest and kept him grounded in ways he could not explain. But he told her that he would be willing to help in other ways, to speak at events, mentor other parents who were just starting their own journeys into the language they had not expected to learn. Evelyn accepted his answer with the same directness she had shown the night she crossed the street. She told him that the offer would remain open, that she understood the value of a man who knew what he needed, and that she hoped he would reconsider someday. He did not reconsider, but he did go back to Helena's class, this time as a teaching assistant, helping new parents who sat in the same chairs he had sat in, their faces carrying the same mixture of hope and exhaustion he remembered so well. He showed them how to form the difficult signs, how to slow down when they were frustrated, how to keep practicing, even when it felt like they would never get it right. Every evening he came home to Maya, sat down across from her at the small kitchen table, and signed to her about his day. Not because he had to, but because he had finally learned that the language was not the point. The point was the moment after the last sign, when she looked at him and smiled, and he knew that she had been heard. The final session of Helena Cruz's advanced immersion course fell on a Saturday in early December, and Leo arrived early, as he always did, to set up the chairs and check the lighting and make sure the coffee was fresh. The room was small and unremarkable, a community center basement with beige walls and fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency most people did not notice. But to Leo, it had become something close to sacred. It was the place where he had learned to fail and keep going. The place where he had learned that understanding was not a destination, but a practice. The new parents filed in slowly, their faces carrying the familiar weight of exhaustion and hope. A woman in her 30s whose son had been diagnosed with hearing loss at birth, and who had spent the last year teaching herself a language she had never expected to need. A man in his 50s, a grandfather raising his granddaughter, who had signed up for the course because he refused to let a communication barrier separate him from the only family he had left. A young couple whose daughter had just received her first cochlear implant, their hands still uncertain, their questions still tentative. Leo moved among them, offering quiet corrections, patient encouragement, the occasional shared laugh when someone made a mistake he recognized from his own early days. He showed them how to position their hands for a sign that required precision. I told them that it was okay to be slow. I told them that their children would remember the effort long after they forgot the mistakes. At the end of the session, Helena Cruz stood at the front of the room and signed to the class, her movements crisp and authoritative, her face carrying the particular warmth of a teacher who had seen hundreds of students pass through her doors and still believed in each one. She told them that they had made progress. She told them that the real work would begin after they left this room, in the quiet moments at home when no one was watching, and the only measure of success was whether they kept trying. The class applauded, a sound that felt small in the basement room, but carried more weight than any standing ovation Leo had ever witnessed. Afterward, as the last students filed out into the cold December air, Helena motioned for Leo to stay. They stood alone in the empty room, the fluorescent lights humming above them, and she signed to him with a seriousness that made him pay attention. "You have become the kind of teacher I hoped you would become," she signed. "But there is something I want to ask you." Leo waited. "I am retiring at the end of this year," she signed. "I have been doing this for 34 years, and my hands are tired. I have been looking for someone to take over the course. Someone who understands what it means to learn this language, not from a textbook, but from a child. Someone who has failed and kept going. I am asking you, Leo." I stood in the quiet of the basement room, the weight of her question settling into his chest. He thought of the night he could not understand Maya. He thought of the rain against the window. He thought of the borrowed suit and the standing ovation, and the feeling of his daughter's forehead pressed against his. The first class he taught on his own was held in the same basement room on a Tuesday evening in January. Maya sat in the back row, her small hands folded in her lap, watching him with a pride she did not need to sign for him to understand. He began the way Helena had taught him, with a simple question, asked slowly, asked with care. Leo nodded. He looked at Maya. She smiled, and he began to teach.